Hey everyone, National Master Steven Adams here, and today I want to talk to you about a principle I actually came up with myself. This is, of course, the idea that your opponent's good pawn move is your good pawn move. Now, at first, this sounds way too easy, right? There's no way that chess can be this simple. But I actually find this principle to be extremely helpful, and the exceptions to it are usually few and far between, and these exceptions are generally found in the opening, where the goal isn't to make a lot of pawn moves anyway, instead, developing the pieces and castling is usually more urgent. But for a middle game strategic principle, I use this over and over again. The first example I want to show you comes from a very famous game played in the World Championship match between Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky. In Game 5 of the match, Boris Spassky, playing white, played the move pawn to a4. So this move is interesting because the idea is to push the pawn to a5 and create a weakness on the king side. I made a video on this a few days ago about this technique called the rook pawn run, where the idea is to push the rook pawn and to create a weakness in the opponent's camp. So we see that white wants to play the move a5, and going by that principle, or if we can deduce from that, if we know that white wants to play a5, Fischer here played the move a5 himself. And this move is very, very good because in addition to stopping white's push and preventing white from creating that weakness on the b6, this move fixes the pawn on a4 where it can become a weakness to black's pieces. So, for example, the bishop on d7 can hit it, and while it looks like it does create a backward pawn on d6, or on b6 rather, this pawn on a4 is much more accessible to black's pieces than this pawn on b6 is. And due to this weakness on the pawn on a4, this game actually ended 11 moves from now in Fischer's favor. So, believe it or not, this game was over in 11 moves due to that weakness. So, let's see what happened. Next, Spassky played the move rook b1, and Fischer played bishop to d7, hitting that pawn. And then Spassky played rook to b2. We have rook b8 defending the b6 pawn, giving it extra protection. And then Spassky swings the rook over, rook b to f2. So now the pressure is off of the b6 pawn. This is totally fine, but this a4 pawn is still very much a weakness. And if we ever win this a4 pawn, if black ever wins it, then this passed a pawn is going to be very strong. Fischer continues queen to e7, bishop to c2 to offer some more protection for the a4 pawn, but then after g5 is played, Fischer is getting a nice grip on these dark squares here, very good harmony with this light square bishop to have all the pawns on dark squares. And after the move bishop d2 played by Spassky, we have queen to e8. And this is very good, as now we are lined up against the pawn on a4, and really there's nothing but for Spassky to do but just shuffle around. He goes bishop to e1 next, but then after queen to g6, we see two weaknesses in the white camp. Black has also turned their attention to this e4 pawn. We have queen to d3, and now Fischer goes knight to h5, going to bring the knight to f4 next, and we just see the principle of two weaknesses here, how black is spread between these two pawns. And now all the rooks are traded off. And now we start to see some issues that white may have, because this bishop on e1 is totally useless. It can't contribute at all, while this bishop on a4 is stuck in a purely defensive role. So next we have the move bishop to d1, trying to attack this knight. And maybe if Spassky is allowed to trade this bishop for this knight and get into an opposite color bishop in game, there might be good chances to hold. But Fischer plays the move knight f4 here, and now Spassky plays queen c2, staying on both of the pawns. But this opens white up for a devastating tactic, and I'll pause the video here. You can pause it here if you'd like, and try to find this move that Fischer played that forced Spassky's resignation, and we can resume in 3, 2, 1. So the absolutely crushing move here is bishop takes a4. And we finally see the weakness of the a4 and e4 pawns, how we can finally use that to win the game. The idea, of course, is that, well, we just won this pawn, But if Spassky recaptures with the queen, queen takes a4, then we take on e4, and suddenly we have queen takes e1 threatens checkmate, and queen takes g2 threatens checkmate. And white just can't get out of this. There's just no way to stop both of those threats. They can try king to f2, but then knight d3 is completely crushing as well. So there's just nothing that Spassky can do at this point. And of course, if you decline the bishop on a4, let's say you play queen to d2, well, you're going to run into much the same problems after we trade the bishops and just play queen takes e4 still. In addition to being down 2 pawns here, white also has all of these same threats still going on. This black a pawn is running down the board too, so this is just completely crushing no matter what happens. So going back to the beginning of the game, we see that meeting a4 with a5 was absolutely the right thing to do. If we played something slower like king h7, it's easy to imagine Spassky going a5, and suddenly we might actually see this pawn on b6 become a weakness instead. So we see that a5 is white's good pawn move, so if we think that, our opponent's good pawn move is our good pawn move, we should naturally then lead us to the move a5 ourselves, and we saw how that played out, how this pawn on a4 is much more of a weakness than the pawn on b6. To end off this video, I will now hand it over to you. This comes from a classical game that I recently played. So my opponent was rated in the mid-2300s, and it's black to play here. So your task here is to find white's good pawn move, to find their good move, and then to see what I did in response. So if you want to pause here, you can. But yeah, I'll tell you in 3, 2, 1. So white's idea here is to play the move e5. So let's say if I played something slow like h6, they would play e5 and bring this knight in to e4 to d6. And this would be a huge problem, right? If we let this e5 move happen, supporting the outpost on d6 and let the knight jump in here. So I saw that my opponent was trying to play e5, and of course that naturally led me to the move pawn to e5 myself. And this is a very good move, as now this knight is completely boxed out, and this also lends support to the knight on d4. So yeah, that's how you could come to that conclusion. So yeah, I hope that's instructive and helpful, and you'll start thinking about this principle some in your own games, and looking, if you see good moves for your opponent, good pawn moves for your opponent, you might think about playing those pawn moves yourself. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.